family mode.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Lee, and I just want to welcome everyone. It is now 1 p.m., so we'll begin our presentation shortly. Today on March 8th, we'll have our presentation on using design guidelines to control strip developments. For help during today's webcast, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box found in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions, please feel free to type those in the questions box and we'll be able to answer those after the presentation. Here is a list of sponsoring chapters, divisions, and universities. I would like to thank all of the participating chapters, divisions, and universities for making these webcasts possible. These are the upcoming webcasts. To register for these upcoming webcasts, please visit utahapa.org/webcast. We're now offering distance education webcasts to help you get your ethics or law credits before the end of the year. These webcasts are available to view at utahapa.org webcast archive. Follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook to receive up-to-date information to the Planning Webcast series sponsored by chapters, divisions, and universities. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, please go to planning.org/CM, select today's date, select today's webcast. This will be available for 1.5 CM credit. At this time, I would like to introduce the presenters for today. Ross has been the planning director for the town of Salem, New Hampshire for 29 years, where he provides staff support for the Planning Board of Conservation Commission. He has extensive experience in subdivision and site plan permitting as well as writing and enforcing land use regulations and zoning ordinances. He has taught courses on controlling strip development, managing residential growth, and evaluating development proposals for the University of New Hampshire continuing education program. He holds a bachelor degree in economics and environmental studies from Colby College and a master's in regional planning from University of Massachusetts. Sarah Korjeff is a planner and historic preservation specialist at the Cape Cod Commission, a regional planning and regulatory agency serving the 15 towns in Barnstable County, Massachusetts. She works with communities to develop bylaws and design guidelines that protect the region's distinctive character, referencing historic architectural forms and past development patterns. Ms. Korjeff coordinated production of the Cape Cod Commission's design manual, Designing the Future to Honor the Past, and was a principal author of the Commission's latest design guidelines publication, Contextual Design on Cape Cod, Design Guidelines for Large-Scale Development. She holds a bachelor degree in history from Middlebury College and a master's in historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. Terry DeWan is a principal of Terrence DeWan Associates and landscape architecture and planning firm in Yarmouth, Maine. Terry has over 35 years of professional experience in landscape architecture, visual resource assessment, design guidelines, site planning, and community development. His experience involves work with communities, developers, state and federal agencies, utility companies, and the forest products industry in New England. He has written numerous award-winning studies on design guidelines, community planning, visual impact assessment, recreation planning, and highway corridor redevelopments. At this time, I would like to hand it off to Ross, who will be the first presenter for today. Hello, Ross.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much. Can you see my presentation?
We see you now.
Great. Well, welcome everyone from snowy New Hampshire and New England. Ben had told us we had about 800 people registered for the session, and we welcome you all and thank you for attending. This is basically a repeat of a presentation that Terry and Sarah and I gave at the 2011 National Planning Conference in Boston. Sarah and I actually followed that up with an article for zoning practice in November of 2011. The format for today is as follows. I'm going to give an introduction to the topic and talk about my experiences here in Salem. Sarah is then going to talk about the work that she's done on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and then Terry will talk about his work and more of a general overview of design guidelines and his experiences. You might notice that that Terry is last, and that's because he's the landscape architect, and we know they always have the best pictures. I'd like to start with just an overview of Salem, New Hampshire. Ben, I'm not seeing that on my screen. Do you see it?
Could you try to advance the slides with the PowerPoint, the left bottom corner?
It's not going.
Try double clicking the PowerPoint.
Okay, there we go.
There you go. There we go.
This is an overview of Salem, New Hampshire. We have a population of about 30,000 people. We're just 32 miles north of Boston. Some people confuse us with Salem, Massachusetts, but that's actually in a northeastern part of Massachusetts. Salem, New Hampshire is a regional employment and shopping hub, and probably the defining physical characteristic or land use characteristic in Salem is that we've got a 6-mile-long corridor that's zoned for retail development. We're also the first community over the border from Massachusetts. We've got 2 exits on Route 93. Here's an overview picture of the strip, which we know as New Hampshire Route 28, also known as North and South Broadway. We've got hundreds of stores, we've got thousands of employees, and over $1 billion in sales coming from that strip. And this strip is a combination of national retailers and a lot of local shops, and also a very large million-square-foot mall, which we know as the Mega Mall. Salem is a pro-growth community. The people here want tax revenue from new development, particularly retail stores. New Hampshire does not have a sales tax, so many retailers want to locate in Salem. My goal, really since coming here, has been to improve the aesthetic character of the strip while accommodating the demand for retail growth. Here's some pictures of some of the typical development that we've seen in the past, and this is really typical of retail strips in general. I think you've got unattractive buildings, you've got cluttered signs, extensive amounts of pavement, very limited landscaping, a very automobile-oriented landscape. Since I came to town, the Planning Board has approved almost $4 million, 4 million square feet of retail development, and that's since 1984. And that includes the million-square-foot mall that we have. Most of my time is actually spent reviewing proposals for new development. I've worked on hundreds of retail developments in the last 29 years. We've done a lot of different things in Salem to try to control that strip development. We've started, or we had done zoning map changes to reduce the amount of area zoned for retail development. We've put limits on the size of retail stores. We've adopted some non-retail districts. We've worked on sign ordinances and landscaping regulations. We've done a lot with traffic regulations, road impact fees, private road improvements. And probably in the late 90s we started looking at and adopting retail design regulations, particularly dealing with architecture and landscaping and signage and lighting. I think these are the key issues in terms of improving the aesthetics. In fact, our first design regulations were adopted back in 1997. But around that time I became aware of the concept of design guidelines. And I felt that these were really the next evolution of the tools to address aesthetic issues and to control strip development. I especially admired guidelines from Falmouth, Maine. I found out later that Terry had actually prepared those, and also the work from the Cape Cod Commission with their Designing the Future to Honor the Past booklet. I was very impressed with that in terms of the illustrations and the drawings and the concepts that they talked about. You might be interested in what the difference is between design regulations and design guidelines, and I'm not sure that there's any real definition. At least when I use the terms, I think of regulations as primarily text and primarily mandatory. I find in my experience that most of the board members and a lot of applicants don't really understand, or they can't really visualize the text regulations. A lot of applicants would ask me, what do you really want to see after reading our design regulations? I see guidelines as primarily being more flexible and focusing on photographs and perhaps the details of development that you wouldn't see typically in regulations. I think pictures make a huge difference when we can show applicants and even board members pictures, photographs of typical development. I think that makes a big difference, and that's certainly been a big difference in some of the projects that I've worked on here. So we were lucky enough to get a grant from the New Hampshire Department of Transportation as part of the Interstate 93 widening project, and we were able to hire a consultant. We hired Terry to do the work for us to put together design guidelines. And we held a kickoff meeting with the development community. We invited sign companies and landscapers and builders and property owners, as well as the media. We were actually able to put together some guidelines. Primarily, that work was done by Terry. I helped a little bit in terms of reviewing it. We brought those guidelines to the planning board. We posted them on the web page. Ultimately, they were adopted as part of our site plan review regulations. And I've listed a web page here where you can see those guidelines if you'd like to see them. I'll be giving just a little bit more information about them. They were adopted as voluntary guidelines. The planning board wanted to spend a couple of years, see how they were accepted by the development community, see how they were in terms of working with them on a day-to-day basis with applicants. One thing we might want to get into when we take questions and answers is how these types of guidelines could be prepared with little or no money. I'd like to talk about that in some detail. I've got some ideas, and maybe Terry and Sarah have some ideas too. So here's the title page to the design guidelines, and I think right away you can see that it's a different type of document. There are photographs. These are all sites in Salem that were taken by Terry, and they kind of, I think at the very beginning, when you first look at the guidelines, you see that this is not the typical standard zoning regulations. And in fact, the purposes of the design guidelines are really to guide the appearance of new projects, to illustrate and expand what we had for design regulations, and to help applicants understand what the town wants. We have chapters on site planning, architecture, landscaping, lighting, and signage. Here's just a typical page from the guidelines. You'll see a lot of pictures. In this particular about architectural principles, we're showing both good and not so good examples, but the idea is that we've used a lot of photographs to illustrate the guidelines. Here's another sample page showing landscaping, parking lot landscaping. Each chapter actually has objectives, goals, and then the actual guidelines. And the document actually has about 250 separate guidelines, but primarily consists of pictures of things that we'd like applicants to see. I just wanted to end with some my introductory comments with some photographs of some of the newer projects that we've gotten in Salem. I think they illustrate the things we're trying to accomplish with the design guidelines, particularly more attractive buildings and improved signage and landscaping. This happens to be a Lowe's that was built on the southern portion of our strip, very close to the Massachusetts border. And probably one of the most difficult things we can do is make a very large cement block building look attractive. And I think this one, a lot of different techniques were used by the architects to do that. Likewise, I see a big improvement in the signage here as opposed to some of the other nearby places. This is a little bit different style, obviously, but this is an Italian restaurant just off of Route 28 that opened up recently and is doing spectacularly well. This is a new CVS project that was built again in the southern portion of the strip and illustrated a lot of the guidelines that we're trying to accomplish. This is a supermarket, and one of the nice things about this market and the other projects is that they all seem to open within a year, year and a half of each other, and it did the combination of them coming so close together gave a lot of momentum, I think, to the planning board and to other applicants for people to see the types of development that we were getting and what we wanted to see. These projects went fairly quickly through the planning board too, and I think that was not unnoticed by other applicants in the community. This is the one of the latest projects that came into the planning board. This is another pharmacy that's coming in. I think did a very nice job in terms of the architecture. And this slide was kind of interesting because it illustrates a before and after situation. And I think to me at least, it illustrates the power of aesthetic improvements to change the character of a retail strip. I joke with my planner friends that this is probably the best looking tattoo parlor in New Hampshire. I think the lesson here is that design guidelines are an essential tool to improve the aesthetic character of strips. From my experience, they help not only applicants understand what the planning board is looking for, but they help the staff explain that to applicants. They help the planning board itself. I've had several experiences with the planning board not being sure what they wanted to do or negotiating architecture and landscaping and signage with the applicant. The photographs in our design guidelines are a big help towards completing those negotiations pretty quickly. So I've listed my contact information here. If anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to take them when we're done with the presentations, but also don't hesitate to email or call. Be happy to try to answer any questions. Now I'd like to pass it on to Sarah to talk about some of her experiences at the Cape Cod Commission in Massachusetts.
Okay, just waiting for mine to come up. Great, my name is Sarah Korjeff, and I work with the Cape Cod Commission, which is a regional planning and regulatory agency. It's one of two in Massachusetts. And we've been using design guidelines since the early 1990s to try to guide development in the 15 towns of Barnstable County, which is also known as Cape Cod. And today my task is to talk to you about 2 region-wide examples of design guidelines that we've developed, tell you about how we developed them and how they're being used, and then talk about one set of guidelines that we developed for a specific area, the Route 132 commercial corridor in Hyannis. So the first manual that we put together, we titled Designing the Future to Honor the Past, Design Guidelines for Cape Cod, and that's the one that Ross mentioned. And we published that in 1994. Because the Cape Cod Commission is a regional agency, we really wanted to develop design guidelines that would apply to the region as a whole. That can be kind of difficult because of the variation that you'd find through 15 different towns with numerous different downtowns and outlying areas. So we tried to focus on the distinctive character of the region, those elements that we really saw that continued from one community to the next, and really that were what make people come to Cape Cod. For anyone who's not familiar with our area, vacationers and retirees are really a significant part of our economy, and so it's essential that we do what we can to protect our character. So we developed this manual really to appeal to multiple audiences. It's intended to provide guidance both to those who were undergoing review by the Cape Cod Commission, because we review large-scale developments, but also to provide guidance to developers and the towns themselves in the region so they'd have something to refer to as they're reviewing smaller-scale projects. And our initial design manual includes guidelines that really range from large issues like building siting all the way down to more specific things like signage. But the underlying principle throughout is really to guide development to be consistent with the Cape's traditional character. We do have some focus on strip development areas, both improved design for strip areas, but also some focus at trying to prevent the expansion of strip development and instead focus development more in downtowns and established villages. But we looked at all the issues. We starting with big picture issues like site design and following it right down through the smaller elements like signage. In terms of process, we developed this manual with the help of a consultant and with a series of public meetings where we could get input from town planners as well as developers and property owners. And we developed it over the course of about 2 years. The guidelines were then adopted as a regulation by the Cape Cod Commission, and we use them specifically in our review of large-scale developments. But they're also used informally by a number of the towns in our region, specifically planning boards, town planners, and architectural review boards have been using them in site plan review and other development reviews, and one town has formally adopted them specifically to guide their review in commercial districts. But beyond actual guidelines for site design and architectural forms and things like that, there are 2 chapters in this design manual that I think really make it a little bit unique and a little more likely to be implemented. And the first of those sections is the case study chapter. We included 4 case studies of development scenarios that we were seeing frequently in Barnstable County, and then we applied some of the guidelines from the manual to each of those scenarios and tried to illustrate how they could affect the design. The scenarios we looked at are commercial strip redevelopment, compact residential development, historic center development and expansion, and large-scale commercial development. But since we're looking at strip development today, I'll talk more about that specific element. The strip redevelopment scenario acknowledges the variety of problems with existing conditions in a strip commercial area. Things like a large volume of curb cuts and curb cut conflicts, lack of consistent architecture, residential isolation if there's any residential development at all, and a lot of visual clutter. And so the case study here attempts to address these issues through 4 different phases of work. And the first is groundwork, essentially creating a master plan for the area, and that might involve amending your zoning. Second is green intervention, which requires consolidating curb cuts, installing sidewalks and street trees, providing open space, essentially elements that help to create a more pedestrian-friendly environment in portions of the Strip. The third phase is that of backlot development, where they construct housing or make connections to surrounding residential neighborhoods that might be within walking distance, and also making facade improvements to the existing commercial buildings there. And finally, infill construction along the street, as well as increasing public transportation opportunities and retrofitting existing signage. The second important piece of the design manual, I think, is a chapter we called Making It Happen. And there we try to focus on ways to facilitate the types of changes that we're seeking in the design guidelines. We recognize that zoning changes are not always easy to accomplish, but they are a critical piece in allowing commercial zones to follow their surrounding context and really change in character. And especially if your surrounding context is a historic area with a denser pattern than what you'd find in more recent zoning, there's really a need to change the zoning to allow the designs that you would like to see. But for strip areas, we have worked with individual towns and discussed zoning changes they needed to go along with guidelines. Things like adjusting building setbacks, building transparency or the amount of glass that you have on the front facades of the building, adopting mixed-use zoning, parking location requirements, landscaping, things like that. But it does go well beyond zoning. There's a real need to work with property owners to identify incentives to guide development to desired locations and in desired forms. So this chapter talks about things like streamlined review processes and how to get them started, transfer of development rights, and also potentially allowing density bonuses. It also acknowledges the need for local investment, really, to make changes happen on the Strip, specifically in infrastructure improvements like public transit, pedestrian and bike facilities, or perhaps design assistance for facade improvements in key locations. So we found that we had a lot of success, really, from this design manual. But over the course of 10 years after it was published, we began to notice that there were certain things we had really wanted to see that weren't happening yet. While historic districts and village centers were often subject to design regulations, the outlying areas in our community, which is where the vast majority of large commercial zones were located, were not as often regulated by guidelines. And even when they were, the guidelines really didn't seem to have enough information about dealing with very large structures, which we were beginning to see more and more of. So it became apparent that we needed further guidance for designing large-scale buildings. And that led us to creating a second design manual for the region. And this one was published in 2008, and we called it Contextual Design on Cape Cod, Design Guidelines for Large-Scale Development. And this manual focuses on large buildings, which is what the Cape Cod Commission regulates the most, since our task is to review large-scale developments in the region. And it's arguably large buildings are what have the most visual impact in the region also. And they provide quite a challenge for towns to review just because of their unique situation and the wide variety of impacts that they can have. So as with our first design manual, this was developed on a regional scale in an effort to provide a starting point for all towns in the region as well as the Cape Cod Commission. In terms of process, we handled this one a little bit differently, though. This manual, because it was very focused on a specific building type, we developed with a group of architects who served as our advisory panel. So this document, though, became an addendum to our initial design manual, so it was also adopted as regulations by the Cape Cod Commission, and many of the towns and boards on the Cape, like with the first design manual, now use this for their design review on an informal basis, though we have encouraged towns to adopt it more formally, and one of the towns in the region has done that and uses it in their commercial zones. This manual really introduces the concept of contextual design. And when we talk about guiding development that would be consistent with the area's traditional character, that's what's called contextual design. The manual focuses on two main things: ways to site large buildings and ways to break down large building masses into smaller elements that are consistent with our region's traditional building forms. It breaks down the siting chapter into two different scenarios, though. Guidelines for centers or downtown areas that are appropriate in more densely developed areas, and guidelines for outlying areas, recognizing that there are two different techniques really that would be appropriate in those two different areas. In terms of applying it to a strip development area, you really need to know what your goals are for that area, whether you're hoping to have it act more like a center or maybe connect to an adjacent, more heavily developed area, or whether you're hoping that part of your strip commercial area might take on characteristics of a more outlying area, providing a break between more heavily developed areas. But you can see we developed two different icons to help folks using the manual because they could identify whether certain techniques were appropriate in the more densely developed centers or in the more rural outlying areas. We have 11 main siting strategies in the manual, and this is just a sample page. You can see the icon at the top of the page, which identifies that this is appropriate for work in centers or more densely developed areas. And I want to just take a second to note the benefit of good graphics, something that Ross also mentioned. We found that using both photographs as well as drawings, simple illustrations to illustrate the possibilities has been very helpful in reaching people. Here you can see on this page they illustrate techniques for recreating or reestablishing the street edge, both by showing a photograph of a building that's located right on the street edge, and also by showing a series of illustrations of various ways to move buildings right up to the street edge and hide the kind of large facilities that might be associated with typical development on the strip. So I wanted to just talk about some of the key siting strategies that are appropriate for strip development. If your strip is adjacent to a sort of more developed downtown or village center area, we recommend following the established historic patterns that are there, placing buildings close to the street with narrow facades facing the street edge, using proportions that are similar to the established patterns, varying long facades. Also incorporating small tenant spaces in the front of a large building is a way to break up and provide a lot more activity in the front facade of a building that's more consistent with our traditional patterns. And defining and enhancing the street edge in general by moving buildings closer to the street or using landscape features or street trees to continue a building line and defining the street edge. Large buildings can also overwhelm the street and have a big impact on outlying areas that are more rural in character, especially when they have large parking lots associated with them in the front of the building. Now, we recognize that relocating buildings or entire parking lots may not be possible, so in those situations, really effective buffers and landscaping are necessary. So we recommend using topography to help screen the buildings and parking areas or create effective landscape buffers in these areas that you're hoping to establish more of an outlying or more rural character on the roadway. And alternatively, if you're in more of a densely developed center, you can shield development with smaller frontage buildings. Large buildings, of course, mean large parking lots, and they themselves, the parking lots, can have negative impacts. And so the guidelines offer ways of screening visible lots breaking them up into smaller components with significant landscaping in the middle. And in doing that, you can also have the benefit of providing refuge for pedestrians and also opportunities for LID stormwater treatment. The second section of the manual deals with building strategies, and we have 12 main building strategies. Again, here's a sample page, and you can see there are icons for both centers and outlying areas at the top of this page. And again, we used a variety of illustrations, both photographs and drawings, to help convey the concepts so that people could really understand what we were looking for. Just to touch on some of the key building strategies we've recommended, first of all, breaking down the building mass of these large structures with smaller submasses. So rather than having one large building, certain uses lend themselves really to being accommodated in several smaller buildings. Medical facilities and offices are two examples, and they can be grouped around a small courtyard or green, which could be part of their program actually. And if that's not possible, larger buildings can also be broken down into several smaller attached masses, which really follows the more traditional pattern for development in our region. Also, looking at building articulation, it's very important. Incorporating changes in building setback, in building height and roof lines are important. And this is where having a group of architects as our advisory board helping us to put this together was really very helpful. You can see their impact here a lot, where we have guidelines dealing with varying facade lines, incorporating open wall elements, varying wall heights and roof lines, and specifically bringing down building edges with smaller attached masses to try to provide a more pedestrian-oriented scale. That's really one of our key strategies. And now I just want to take a moment to talk about a specific example of applying these guidelines in the city of Hyannis on Cape Cod. Because sometimes the best work is really done when you can apply design guidelines to a specific area. And that's what we've tried to focus on in the years since we produced the second design manual, working with specific communities to try to develop guidelines for a specific roadway. The Route 132 commercial corridor in Hyannis is characterized by strip commercial development. It was primarily developed in the 1970s and later. So here we were able to apply the guidelines, look at its context, identify specific issues and opportunities, and make some design recommendations. The town approached us to do this. They had a real interest in changing the character of the roadway, and so did property owners there. Specifically, they were looking to make it safer for pedestrians and other users and more attractive for businesses to try to attract, to try to fill some of the vacant spaces that they have. So we looked at this area, and you can see it outlined in the image on the right-hand side. We were looking for patterns. If there's no clear context, sort of a existing village center or downtown commercial area that is already located adjacent to the strip, you have to decide whether you want to build off of other patterns in the region, or whether you can find a pattern that exists in your strip area that would really result in the type of or form of development you would like. So we looked at the length of the corridor, looked at the users, the building footprints, development patterns, and road characteristics. And we were able to define discrete segments to break the corridor down into smaller parts that could be recognized for their unique character. It also made it a lot more manageable to work with one small piece at a time. So we defined those distinct areas and created different goals and different design guidelines for each of them. So the corridor would read less as a long, consistent strip, but more as a series of neighborhoods that you would pass through. And in particular, we chose one area where we felt it was important to really integrate more landscaping and more green open space areas to sort of provide a break between more densely developed spots. So the main guidelines involved establishing appropriate scale of building at the street front, moving parking to the rear, and creating wide landscape buffers in areas where there were large parking lots close to the street. Essentially, we were looking to change the relationship between the buildings and the street, linking them more clearly. And we felt that offering two possible solutions in many locations was helpful, recognizing that it's not always possible to relocate a building in the short term, but in the long term, when you have the potential for a site to be redeveloped, then that is what you're hoping to achieve in some cases. But we illustrated the options with simple graphics. You can see here an example. The top half of the graphic shows the existing cross-section of the roadway with the right-of-way and the parking and buildings. And the image below shows two potential solutions or ways to change the character. On the right-hand side, we assumed redevelopment occurred and the building was actually moved up closer to the street with street trees and additional pedestrian facilities. Whereas on the left-hand side, we assumed that the building would stay where it exists today, but rather than having the large parking lot in front, we installed a significant landscape strip with potentially a berm or fencing and a lot of vegetation to help hide the parking area. Let's see. We also identified areas where infill development was appropriate, either to provide a pedestrian focus that could connect existing activity areas with residential neighborhoods that were nearby, or sometimes infill development was appropriate to act as a shield for large parking lots and buildings behind. We also tried to draw attention to underappreciated resources. Here, this illustration is of one of the main accesses to a mall along the Route 132 corridor. And here we suggested additional pedestrian scale buildings, essentially all of the pitched roofs buildings that you can see. I believe there are 5 in the foreground. Those are all new structures that are proposed. And the idea was to help create a link to the scale of buildings in a nearby residential neighborhood and take advantage of that. So really, we found the importance of illustrations when we did some graphics like this. The people were really excited, the property owners were very excited to see this. It really helped them visualize what the design guidelines could look like in the future if they followed them, and it seemed to be very effective. So just thinking of commercial strip development, though, one last thing to recognize is the shrinking retail market that we see, as well as competition from other areas of the community which might be involved in revitalization efforts, places like downtowns or main streets that might also be struggling to fill in their vacant spaces. So your guidelines need to make an effort to really differentiate these areas, both in design and in the desired uses and activities, in an effort to help both of them succeed. So I'd like to wrap up just by saying I think it's worthwhile to get design guidelines out there because it's really hard to make changes without having a vision for the area that people can really latch onto. And then follow the guidelines with making changes to regulations. And if you want to see the full design manuals that I talked about today, there's a link at the top of this page that would allow you to see the full document. And at this point, I'll turn my presentation over to Terry DeWan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just get this set up here. Okay, I'm assuming that everybody can see this now. My name is Terry DeWan. I'm a landscape architect in Yarmouth, Maine, and as Ross said, I am the landscape architect for this presentation tonight. And as such, I'll be using a lot of illustrations, a lot of photographs from some of the work that we've done over the last several years. So, recognize this place. Does it shout out at you as to where you might be? And I think the answer is really it could be just about anywhere. And this happens to be up in Windham, Maine, but it could be in Nebraska or Arkansas, you name it. And I think part of the work that we do is to try and encourage communities to develop their own identity, to establish a vision for their own commercial areas. Rather than talk about a lot of the details, I'm going to stress two topics. First of all, implementation tips, things that we've learned over the last 15 years or so that we've been developing design guidelines, and some of the lessons that we've learned from listening to our clients, people like Ross, people like economic development officials, developers, franchisees, and so forth. Ross has talked about a number of these things already, so I'll go over some of them rather quickly. The question that always comes up, are we developing guidelines or standards? It's the thou should versus thou shall. Most of the towns that we deal with prefer to have guidelines that, as Ross said, allow a lot of flexibility as opposed to standards, which are requirements. This has to do, of course, with the political will of the community, whether or not they really feel that they want something badly enough that they're going to force people to go in a certain direction. It's important then, once a decision is made, guidelines versus standards, that the language in the document is consistent, that they always use either a shall or a should to make sure people understand what they're dealing with. The V word, the guidelines should be really based upon a vision, and how are visions manifested through words, through improvement plans, and just through traditions. This is a vision statement that we developed working in the town of Raymond, Maine. Their vision was that it should be a linear village. Their strip development was really their downtown. They wanted to emphasize bicycle pedestrian connections, pedestrian scales, buildings closer to the road, parking in the rear, and so forth. This is a vision statement for Falmouth, Maine that Ross showed the design guideline that we developed probably 15 years ago. This was developed after a long process involving many, many people that looked at how the area could change and evolve over the years. And so we developed both a plan view on the left as well as the aerial perspective on the right. Wonderful illustration by C. Michael Lewis. So when people see this, they really get the idea. This is what we're trying to achieve. And without a vision, you sort of have to ask, well, what should the gas stations look like? Where should the pumps be? Should they be in the front? Should they be in the back? Should there be hoods over the stations? Is this going to be acceptable? Or are we really looking for something like this? This happens to be in Rhinebeck, New York, another gas station, but it's the same service. The gas stations in this location, however, decided to put the pumps out back, and when you drive by, because of the material, because of the sighting, the signage, and so forth, it feels like it belongs in this wonderful countryside of Rhinebeck, New York. This happens to be in Camden, Maine. The guidelines here talk about locating buildings close to the street, about an articulation of entranceways, incorporation of micro groups of plantings and flowers and so forth. So here's a town with a real definite vision. Avoiding the rubber stamp. Too often client communities will call us in and say, wow, I've seen your work in, name the town, and they say, we want a set of guidelines just like them. Well, that may be fine if the community looks just like the other town, and so our message to the community is make sure that what you end up with really is yours. It's okay to start with a prototype, but we want to make sure that the guidelines that are developed encourages both creativity as well as economic development and are used as a way to reinforce the town's vision. This, for example, is a typical shopping center. It could be just about anywhere. This happened to be a vision in Falmouth, Maine, that knew that they didn't want the standard boxy look, and so their vision was to come up with something that resembled the more agrarian forms that were found nearby. Process is very key. As Ross went over some of the things that we did in Salem, it's important to take your time, not to rush this. There's nothing worse, I think, than making the town council or the select board feel that this is something which is being pushed through. It's important to work with representative committees, although we've done some where we work with no committees. We've worked with some where we've had as many as 43 different meetings. It's also important, we feel, to involve both the landowners and developers as well as the design community, and to get as much public input as possible to make sure that it's done right. This is a series of illustrations that we did up in Raymond, Maine, to show people an example of what we're talking about in the design guidelines. This is what the area looks like right now, and this is a simulation to show what it might look like in the future. We had another slide that showed an interim step with the building pushed back a little bit further. But the point here is to make sure people realize the implications of the guidelines, that it's going to it may involve very fundamental ways that the town will change over the next several generations. Now, what's the point of view of the audience, and who is the audience for the guidelines? Well, certainly it's the property owners, the people who will be affected by it, the developers who are bringing projects before the town, the immediate abutters, the regulators, the planning boards, and so you really have to think about how they are viewing projects. Sometimes we want to make sure that they have both the big picture as well as the micro view. Micro views might be, for example, looking at signage. This is a pretty standard sign, but somebody driving by at 35 miles an hour is not going to be able to read those signs down there. And so we incorporate in the signage chapter to look at how signage is used. What's the point of view of the actual observer? Somebody driving by on the roadside doesn't need all that information out there. There is a place for it, but it's not next to the roadway. The approach that we take, and Ross has covered some of this, is to develop handbooks that are generally broken down into 5 different chapters. Site planning, which I think is really important, architecture, landscaping, signage, and lighting. What I'd like to do now is go through each of those briefly and to show the sort of things we deal with. And again, you'll have the opportunity at the end here to go to a town of Kittery, Maine. You'll see an example, and you can download their design guidelines. But in most of these chapters, we start out with the general principles. What are we trying to do in terms of site planning? How do you site buildings that make them fit? Dealing with circulation, access management, parking, those key things that deal with the automobiles and the integration of pedestrian spaces into the site planning process. How do you deal with the necessities of life, the service areas, the storage areas? What do you do about multiple building developments, the shopping malls and the clusters that you find so often in these sort of strip developments? How do you screen these things from surrounding residential neighborhoods? What are the new techniques for stormwater management? And are there guidelines that will affect how they look and how they function? The next general chapter is on architecture, a 3-dimensional built environment. We deal with renovations and addition because it's not always new construction. And then we break it down generally into some of the more discrete elements of the architecture, the building materials, the facades, the roof line. But we also feel it's important to deal with the large-scale buildings. We don't go into as much detail as Sarah just talked about, but we try to make sure that people understand that there are ways to reduce the scale of these sort of structures. National franchises are always something which communities have to struggle with, as well as things like linear commercial buildings, the strip development, typical service stations, convenience store, drive-throughs, and so forth. Under landscape principles, again, I'm putting my landscape architect hat on here. This is the softer part of the process. We ask people to be very concerned about parking lot treatments, tree selection, shrubs and ornamentals, tree protection, maintenance, plant list. The object here is, of course, to make it attractive throughout the year and to minimize the maintenance requirements. Lighting is something which very often gets overlooked, but it's a very important part of the whole aesthetic from an energy perspective as well as a design perspective, and we put a lot of effort thinking about how you properly light driveways, parking lots, pedestrian spaces, the facades of buildings, and other special applications. But finally, signage. This is very often one of the more controversial part of any guideline, and we deal with content, dealing with multi-tenant properties, facade-mounted signs, sign lighting, temporary signage, and so forth. Well, let's look at some of these areas in a little bit more detail. As Ross pointed out, the typical chapter starts out with an introduction and an overview. We try to make sure that there's a reference also to the land use code, to the zoning code within the town. And we could talk about that later, but the guidelines are one tool that are used in conjunction with the zoning ordinance, and also often the site plan review ordinance. These deal with a lot of the health, safety, and welfare issues as well as the aesthetics. And then there's always this section on goals. What are we trying to accomplish by this particular chapter? Then you open up the chapter, and then each one of them has a number of different topic areas. And the start of it talks about the objectives of this particular topic, and then the guidelines themselves. Ross mentioned there were about 250 of those that we developed in Salem. I don't doubt that. It was a lengthy document. But then we always provide examples, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. Rather than call them good or bad, we like to call them compliance and non-compliance examples. The one on the left here, under general architectural principles, said these are the sort of things that our particular town, this happened to be Kittery, Maine, is looking for in terms of the style of building, the facades, the materials for the roof, and so forth. While on the other hand, the buildings on the right are examples, are things that probably wouldn't fit into the vision that the town has. A very important part of this, of course, is the text at the bottom here that explains not just what they're looking at, but why these are either going to be compliance structures or non-compliance structures. We feel it's very important to use both the positive and negative examples, and we always get into that question, well, should we use negative examples from our community with the risk of offending somebody? We tend to try and use the positive examples from along the strip within the individual community to try and reinforce things that have been done the right way. It's unfortunately very easy to find a lot of negative examples. You don't usually have to go beyond the town's borders, but we typically look outside of the town just for that reason. From a political standpoint, we want to make sure that we reinforce things that have been done well and not call too much attention to mistakes of the past. We are promoting quality and diversity. We want to make sure the images are picked with a lot of care. We sometimes call them materials to avoid. In the section on materials, in the bottom left there, one thing that this is perhaps a personal issue on my part, this multicolored brick, which seems to be very inappropriate for many towns in New England, as well as things like bright colors and use of 7 different materials on the outside of the building and metal buildings and so forth in certain situations. On the other hand, by making reference to the historic character of the community and their vision, we can talk about the type of materials that we're encouraging, either shingles or the clapboards that we see in some of these examples. It's also important in terms of signage to show what makes for a good sign. And again, there's a lot of text that goes along with this, but the basic message is they should be clear, readable, not a lot of extraneous information, and very often including the address of the facility to facilitate 911 responses. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of things like this, but we also have a lot of good examples around. Rhinebeck, New York, by the train station, in Falmouth, Maine, for a Wendy's. I think it's important also, we've heard a lot about aesthetics, but it's important to realize that the design guidelines are not just about design. We like to think that as we go through the writing of these, and also as a peer reviewer, that we want to take a real strong look at the health, safety, and welfare aspects of it. Very often when the planning board or even the planning department looks at a plan, they look at circles on a very flat piece of paper. And they don't think about what's this going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years. And the example in the background here is a perfectly wonderfully landscaped parking lot, except these large shrubs are going to block the person's view who's backing out of that end space there, and could be a safety hazard. Similarly, here's a new restaurant that was built. Again, it looks very nice, but to somebody who's walking by here, those pebbles, that ground cover, can act just like ball bearings, and somebody could very easily fall, slip, and ultimately sue the owner. So these are the sort of things that are details that we feel are very important to examine as part of the design guidelines. Correlation with the zoning, I mentioned that already, making sure that there is adequate cross-reference between the guideline document and the zoning ordinance. We also feel it's necessary as part of making this as friendly as possible to anticipate the sort of questions that are addressed. So we usually include as part of the introduction a series of questions. What's the purpose of this guideline? Are the provisions mandatory? How is the book organized? How does the town go about developing this? How will it be used? What's the ultimate outcome for the town? We try to avoid ambiguity in language. I know the word unattractive is used by one of the earlier presenters. We try to make sure that the words that we use are very specific, that they are illustrated where necessary, and we even very often have a section on defining terms. We very often would encourage towns to review the guidelines with legal counsel beforehand. And we think it's also very important for the town themselves to lead by example. If we're talking about clear, concise signage, this is what we feel a town should look like. On the other hand, if the town says we don't want to see reader boards, well, here's an example of what we're not looking for. We also feel it's never too late. Too often we get involved in facilities or streets that look like this. We like to think that it's not too late. We can make a difference here. And so we approach every job with a sense of optimism. That was the case several years ago when we were faced with the proverbial Kmart with a shopping, in a big shopping area, no out parcels, big empty building to the right. And Walmart came before the town and says, we want to convert the Kmart to a Walmart. We were going to just put some doghouse additions on the upper stories. We were going to go and put some blue and gray paint on. And that was going to be their approach to the transformation. Well, town didn't think that that was in the best interest of the community. And so they hired us and an architect to look at how that particular building might be transformed. In the process, they said, we better hurry up and make ourselves a set of adequate design guidelines to help guide this process. And so in the course of a very short period of time, again, working with a local committee of informed people and with a very talented architect, we showed Walmart what they could do to this facility. Well, this is their first attempt to come back and meet the guidelines. We said you're about 50% of the way there. They went back, and they came back with this sketch here. Notice they changed from a Chevy to a Volvo. And ultimately, we got about 90% of the things that were talked about in the guidelines that were developed. The top is a view of what it looked like following the reconstruction, the transformation from the Kmart to the Walmart. They really wanted their old-fashioned sign, but we were able to persevere, and this is what we ultimately came up with. Well, fast forward about 10 years, that Walmart is now being tagged as a super Walmart. And once again, we helped Walmart and the town review the project under the terms of the design guidelines. They are then taking over what had been a movie theater on the right-hand side. And as a result, they're starting to be a lot more sensitive to the design aspect and the public safety aspect of it, incorporating things like bus shelters to allow people, to encourage people to come by public transit, a lot more landscaping, good screening for the service areas, a lot more articulation of the buildings. This happens to be the team meeting talking about the Walmart, but it's part of the process. The peer review process we found to be extremely helpful. The peer reviewer is either an architect or a landscape architect who is very familiar with the design guidelines. It's a team effort involving the peer reviewer, the staff reviewer, the architect, landscape architect, the applicant, and very often the applicant's attorney sitting around a table reviewing plans early on in the process. One thing which we always stress to make sure that the planning board understands what it is that is being proposed, and we're very comfortable asking developers to come up with not only illustrations but also a narrative to show people what it is we're trying to do. This happened to be in Camden, Maine, where they had torn down a series of houses which looked very much like the house that the sketch right here. What was proposed was a new drugstore, but the idea was, and the town so well put it, we want something which is going to feel like it fits into our Main Street. And they came up with a Rite Aid that is unusual in that it has a sense of being three interconnected buildings, when in reality it's a brand new building with a very elaborate facade. One thing which I might note is that the second floor here is a totally false set of space. There's nothing that goes on up there, which I think is a real missed opportunity. We asked for narratives because planning board members typically look at a set of plans. For example, the landscape plan and say, yep, it looks pretty, it looks green, but what is it that's trying to be, what's the effect that we're trying to accomplish here? And the landscape narrative should really talk about things like plant material selection, long-term maintenance, the textural qualities of it, and so forth. We also stress as part of the guidelines that the narrative should include a description of the lighting and the signage to make sure the planning board understands there's been a lot of thought given to how all things is put together. We also know that we're never going to achieve 100% acceptance or compliance, but that's a question of political will. And very often towns will go back after a period of 5 years or so, just like a comprehensive plan evaluation, and start the conversation over. What worked? What hasn't worked? What can we do to strengthen it? You look at, McDonald's has come in. Is this the best we can do? How about that? Is this what we're looking for? Or are we really looking for something like this? Attention to details, I think, is extremely important as part of the review process to anticipate some of these, again, the health, safety, welfare issues to avoid problems that could crop up. Maintenance is always a big thing that is part and parcel of any review process, as well as the trying to avoid things which look really good to start with, but in a year or two tend to slip by the board if they're not properly maintained. We feel it's very important to go slowly, to review and modify, to do a design guidelines and manageable steps, to expand them when necessary, to evaluate their effectiveness, to tighten them up as necessary, and also to look to the future, being open to new ideas. For expansions, what happens when the property becomes too large for the dumpster, for example? Technological advances. When we first started doing these things, we had no idea that the whole communication industry was going to invent these sort of changeable advertising areas. And finally, to expect the unexpected. This happens to be one of the last slides from Dallas, Texas, where a very regimented set of design guidelines are put into place, signage, beautiful buildings, landscaping, and when it was finally developed and the sun came on a Sunday morning, they were horrified to see that the word symphony was partly obliterated by the shadow. So as a final note here, I was at an APA conference several years ago, and someone made the statement as part of developing design guidelines, it's important to make sure that places like Burger King look like us, and that we should not look like Burger King. So some contact information. This is where we're located. Here's some contact information. If you're interested in seeing an example of the design guidelines that we've prepared in the past, go to kittery.org, and you can scroll through and find the designed handbook, which is on their website. With that, then, I will turn it back over to Ben, who I think will ask a few questions.
Okay. We'll have time for Q&A. First question is from Cody. Are the black windows in the CVS and those fake windows?
Ben, the black windows in the CVS are not fake. You might have noticed that they were raised up a little bit, but the windows in the Lowe's are in fact fake windows. that was one of the tools used to break up the mass of that building.
Okay.
Yeah, we've seen that quite a bit also. In fact, we've seen some places where they've taken and they've painted the outside of a building so it looks like there's windows, and then they use some material like duct tape to make it look like they've broken down into individual panes. That's one of the beauties of design guidelines, is to ask for elevation details to make sure that the town knows what to expect.
Thank you. Next question is by Alex. If the design guidelines in Salem are voluntary, are incentives provided to developers to achieve the desired developments?
No, not really. The town of Salem, New Hampshire is fortunate in the sense of that location that we have just over the Mass border, 2 exits on the interstate highway, no sales tax. A lot of the retailers want to be here. And so typically we're finding that they're willing to meet the design guidelines for the most part, and that we don't have to give them any incentives to get them to meet those guidelines.
Thank you. Next question is from Robert. Encouraging buildings closer to the street looks attractive, but doesn't that greatly increase the cost associated with widening streets?
Sarah, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll try that. I guess we haven't found that to be a big issue because the right-of-way is already established, and it in many cases, especially along commercial strips in our region, provides additional land that could be used for additional lanes or to provide a median between lanes if that's what they decide is appropriate. What we're talking about is moving buildings closer to the front of the lot, the private lot. And there's still enough room in the public realm, essentially, for pedestrian facilities. So I really don't think it's a cost difference. It's just a design change. And it does take developers and property owners and businesses sometimes a while to get used to that idea. So I think we need to put some effort into convincing them that there are benefits in terms of visibility and attractiveness, so that they'll want to do those things if they aren't required.
One of the frustrations, I think, in doing design guidelines is the communities that just think about the design guidelines per se without putting it into a context of the whole community. And for us, the best thing to do is to first envision what the streetscape is going to look like, how it's going to function, how cars and parking and public transportation and bicycle and pedestrians are thought about, the proverbial complete streets approach. And then the buildings are one aspect of that. And you'll know that as part of going through that process what you're trying to achieve in terms of scale, in terms of community character.
Thank you. Next question is by Richard. Did you have any voluntary or mandatory requirements to integrate green measures into developments such as previous pavement, bioswale, etc.?
Terry, why don't you take that one? I don't know what you've seen in other communities.
Most of the towns are becoming a lot more aware of the low-impact development solutions to handling stormwater. And it depends on the individual towns to determine whether or not they're voluntary or mandatory. Most towns at this point that we deal with have mandatory requirements, but how you approach the treatment is very often voluntary. And that's where design guidelines come in to say, yeah, you have to handle your stormwater in a certain way, and there's multiple ways of doing it. You can make it look very artificial and I hate to use the word engineered, but something which doesn't necessarily relate to the surroundings, or using the same techniques you can make something which is a lot softer or sometimes even hidden that accomplishes the same purpose. And that's, I think, the advantage of guidelines, to be able to show examples of what can be done with things like bioswales, pervious pavement, rain gardens, and so forth.
Thank you. And next question is from Richard again. Do you have minimum green open space requirements for developments in downtown Main Street area and those in outlying areas?
Sarah, why don't you take that one?
Okay. We have, the Cape Cod Commission actually has regulations for open space requirements, and I would say very many of our towns also do. We advocate, though, that in downtown areas where you're looking for denser development with a more pedestrian-oriented focus, that you're allowed to meet those open space requirements off-site. Perhaps it's contributing an equivalent amount of land to a land bank in the community, or perhaps it's even waiving the need for open space, significant parcels of open space in the downtown area. But there are some places or some instances where you would want to have some open space even in the downtown, whether it's a town green or something like that. So the communities really, they have developed different requirements from one to another.
What most towns have, though, are requirements for parking areas, and there's usually a ratio of number of trees per number of parking spaces, or a certain percentage of the parking lots that would be devoted towards green space or landscaping of some sort.
Okay, next question is, your suggestion can result in additional expense for the developers who may balk at implementing them. How do you enforce or require the developers to pay attention to your design standards? Is the planning board approval contingent upon your commission review and approval?
Well,
so you take that one.
Yeah, and a lot of times we do hear from applicants that say they are spending more money than they otherwise would. And again, we're in a situation where we are able to request and require some of those increased standards because they want to be here and they're willing to pay the cost to be here. So it doesn't, every now and then we'll have an applicant who simply can't afford to do it, and then we try to negotiate some compromise typically, and that's where the flexibility comes in play, and that's why adopting these as voluntary standards has helped, I think, for us to get a feel for how difficult or expensive it's going to be to comply with them. Most of the time we don't have any problem.
Thank you. Next question, do you have shading requirements and or require reflective light parking rooftop surfaces?
Sarah, have you heard of that stuff?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. We do not have shade requirements or light parking surfaces requirements. I don't think that's as big an issue in our part of the country as it is further south. But we have started paying more attention to rooftop surfaces, partly because that's where more and more we're seeing proposals for solar panels and other kind of rooftop energy systems, green roofs, things like that. But it's still new enough to us that we have not developed specific requirements for that.
Okay, next question is, one of the arguments I hear from the business community is that reducing the visual impact of parking makes it harder to attract customers since they don't see cars in front of their store and they think the store doesn't attract customers. What answer do you have?
A lot of the times I'm getting trees spaced 20, 30 feet apart, and I'm getting low shrubs that screen out the view of the pavement and maybe a bit of the cars, but the cars are still very visible in the parking lots. And I understand primarily what I hear from merchants is they want their stores to be available. It's not so much a concern for the cars, although I could see where they would think that, but for the most part the merchants and the retailers want their stores and their signage to be visible. They don't care too much about the parking. And typically what we're doing with trees and low shrubs, you're still not screening out
entirely the view of the parking lot. So, Sarah, or Terry?
Yeah, there's also a public safety aspect here. I know that we in our guidelines, we typically don't say that the parked cars should be hidden altogether. We want to make sure that from a policing standpoint, that a police car driving by is going to be able to look into the parking lot and to see if anything is amiss. However, I encourage communities to do some minimal amount of screening. Perhaps a berm and/or plantings that'll screen perhaps the bottom third or bottom half of a car. So you find berms that it might be 2 feet with some vegetation on top of them.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a quick comment saying that I think that's kind of an old argument. I think that was a common complaint that we heard in the sort of the 80s and 90s, but I think there are more and more cases of parking actually being proposed inside structures now. Parking garages or parking underneath commercial buildings, and I think most people feel that with the digital technology we have today that there are fewer and fewer impulse stops that are being made, that people are in most cases are planning ahead and they know right where they're going, so that visibility of parking is not as big a deal.
Thank you. And next question, did you require building foundation requirements given they may be moved to edge of overhangs but yet remain close to foundations, which are often lacking?
Terry, can you take that?
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
Is it foundation plantings or?
Perhaps plantings. Well, let me try and address it from a planting perspective. We, as part of the design guidelines under landscaping, we look for ways to make the building fit gracefully on the land, and sometimes that involves foundation plantings. And also to consider plantings as part of a three-dimensional evaluation of the buildings. And by that I mean making sure that the buildings are considered, the form of the building, so that if there is foundation plantings, that they're not going to overwhelm the space or grow out of the space. Similarly, we want to make sure that the plantings, when they're put in, aren't put in over utility lines, so the roots are not going to go down and penetrate into utility lines. So the design guideline process and the evaluation of development proposals by either the peer review or the planning department needs to look at the holistic look at a site, both above ground and below ground, as well as what's being proposed.
Next question is, did either of you have a situation where all site building developments are required to be LEED or similar certified?
Not in Salem, no.
No, and not on the Cape. We do consider LEED certification to be a benefit, and for large-scale developments that we review, that's one of our basic criteria. You need to either meet LEED criteria or actually have certification, but not typically with the smaller-scale developments.
Yeah, there are some state agencies which are requiring LEED certification, but generally that doesn't get incorporated into a design guideline. Again, if a guideline is voluntary, we can point to LEEDs and similar certification processes like the Sustainable Sites Initiative as models to follow, but most towns are not at a point where they're going to be requiring applicants to meet those requirements.
Thank you. Do you have incorporate crime prevention through environmental design into the design guidelines?
I think it's a great idea, but we haven't done that in Salem.
Not per se, but I think that just an awareness of visibility, the ability for police to circulate throughout the site with ease to make sure that there aren't any hiding places that could be opportunities for people to do unwanted things as part and parcel of the design guidelines. Again, design guidelines imply that it's aesthetics, but from our perspective, it's really looking at health, safety, and welfare.
Yeah, and that's only come up once with us pretty recently, and I guess it was felt that security cameras, the ability to have those in the parking lot and aimed at the building, and this was something the developer wanted to have, that they took care of any of the concerns that the local police raised.
Thank you. And next question. There was a brief reference to improving linkages between commercial strips and adjacent neighborhoods. What approaches did you take, and what are your thoughts on introducing more multifamily housing into these strips?
I think that was me. In terms of improving linkages, what we found at the specific site that I talked about, Route 132 corridor in Hyannis, not too far outside of the commercially zoned area were some residential neighborhoods that were from maybe the 1960s and 70s, and they really had no connection to the commercial strip, and yet the strip offered a number of businesses and uses that would be of interest to them. So one of the primary concerns was really creating safe pedestrian connections and then making those routes comfortable for a pedestrian to travel along. And so that was one of the places where frontage buildings became an interest, because you don't want to walk a long stretch through a parking lot or sort of undeveloped area necessarily unless it's attractive landscape. But so providing buildings that would potentially be interesting to walk along and provide services that would be of interest to the surrounding residential neighborhoods. But also the idea of introducing more multifamily housing into areas where there is not any kind of residential connection, so that you are introducing people who can take advantage of these uses and perhaps bolster certain additional uses in your commercial strip, particularly if you're dealing with a significant number of vacancies.
We always take the attitude that in any commercial site, all four sides of the four-sided building should be treated with some level of sensitivity to the surrounding use, even though it may be a vacant lot. At some point, there's going to be something happening on the backside of a building. And so the relationship between adjacent neighborhoods and the commercial strip is really important. And that then gets recognized when you evaluate the form, the textures, the scale, how it's lit, the lighting aspect of it, to make sure that there is a proper relationship, that the building feels like it belongs in that neighborhood and that it's not an intrusion into it.
Thank you. And due to the time constraints, this will be the last question, and it's for Terry. Where's the right
one? The one that I showed, the photograph that followed a sketch, was in Camden, Maine, one of the more beautiful downtowns in the state of Maine, if not eastern United States.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the great presentation and answering the questions for us today, and we look forward to hearing from you again in Planning Webcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this concludes today's session, and I want to thank everyone again for attending. For further questions regarding the presentation, please contact the presenters. And if you have any questions regarding the webcast series or logging CM credits, or if you want to receive the presentation early, please email me at planningwebcast@yahoo.com. Thank you.